So thank you for the opportunity to speak, behind the scenes or in some small ways. I even am a member of your chapter. I sent in my passport number. Oh my goodness, the bureaucracy is it's considerable. So congratulations on fighting it through and creating the chapter. And I've been in your country, and my grandmother was born in your country. And so I feel an attachment there, and I follow events. And so I'm very pleased to be able to speak with you today. And what I'm going to talk about is the place I see for ACT and its underlying model in the larger realm of evidence-based therapies. The chapter will be connected to a larger body of work because it's not narrowly focused. This work is broadly focused. We're trying to bring evidence-based methods and processes into the lives of people. And so my intention is to try to help create links for friends and allies and fellow travelers, and maybe to soften the boundaries a little bit so that ACT is a foundation and not a fence between yourself and others who are working to alleviate human suffering. So the core question in the ACBS, the Association for Contextual Behavioral Science tradition, is how we can use evidence to rise to the challenge of the human condition. It's our motto, creating a behavioral science more adequate to the challenge of the human condition. And what is that challenge? Well, in this horrible year we've just been through, boy, have we seen a face of that. On the one hand, here's the paradox. We are living in a moment that if you were a baby in the sky and deciding when to be born, you had no idea where in the world you would be born, but you could pick the moment. You couldn't do a better job than picking this moment. That's an empirical fact. In terms of exposure to violence or the longevity of your life, your health, your education, whether or not you'll starve, you couldn't do a better job than picking this moment. In almost every area of importance, save one. You would not necessarily pick this moment if you were looking at your mental and behavioral health, because something has happened in the modern world where even people in the developed world are struggling with so many problems, and you can see it in our young people especially. Children, I'm old enough to say children for young adults. Young adults and children are more likely to struggle with anxiety, depression, etc., than just 30 years ago by, a good portion of a standard deviation. And it's not just self-report, because it's actual suicide rates. So something is happening that is making it harder to be human. And in this horrible year that we just finished, is there anyone who doesn't realize that mental and behavioral health is not a 1 out of 5 issue? It's not just about these little cubby holes of syndromes and labels. It's a 5 out of 5 issue. And it's not a 1 hour a week issue. It's a 24 hours out of 7 days issue. We need to work on our psychological health in the same way that you would work on your physical health. Your strength and resilience physically is not something you care about only when you've been injured or get sick. This is something that's part of your health practices. The same is true with psychological and social well-being. And this year certainly proved it. There's nobody who got through this year of COVID without knowing it's hard to be human, without feeling some significant degree of distress. And let's just turn on the television screen and you can see how much more is out there. It's not just COVID, but it's violence. just in the country next door to you. We're afraid of what might happen very quickly. We don't know with Ukraine, but it's not just that. It's racism, but it's not just that. It's immigration, but it's not this, that. It's climate change, but it's not this, that. It's poverty and inequality economically. And so the challenges of the modern world need to be dealt with. We need modern minds for this modern world. And we have been through an era of putting people into syndromal boxes, succumbing to what I would call the lie of averages, not the law of averages. We chase these wandering targets of syndromes, whether it's the ICD or the DSM, it's the same idea. They wander around, things come in and out. Sometimes very obvious in the back, looking backwards, how bigoted and biased they were. Homosexuality used to be a mental disorder. Can you imagine? I mean, that is not very long ago. We cannot just wash our hands of that. And we have been brought into that with medications development and psychotherapy protocols, these long lists of evidence-based therapies. This is the Division 12 of APA list. And yes, it's very nice that the first 4 entries are the most important. No, they're not the most important. It's just the alphabet. And it's nice that ACT is on that list, but oh, please, no clinician could learn all these methods. And there's massive overlap among all these methods. And each one has their founders and their certification and their, their fees you have to pay to get the anointing. By the way, except ACT, because we prohibited all that early on. The founders will not be tithed to, you don't have to take like belonging to a church and spend 5% of your income to founders. But what does this all mean? The purpose of this was to find out why. The strategy is that if you focus on signs and symptoms, maybe you will discover the processes of origin, development, maintenance, and change. And when you do, you'll have a disease. Unfortunately, in 40, 50 years of this, there's not one psychiatric disease, not one. The last one was untreated syphilis, general paresis. And none of you have clients on your caseload who have untreated syphilis. So it's reasonable, but it fails. It fails when one process can lead to many manifestations, when many different processes can lead to a particular manifestation, and it fails because functional processes within individuals cannot statistically be detected reliably by the behavior of the collective. That belief that it can is called the ergotic error. And it does apply to a few things. The physicists have known since 1931 that you can model the behavior of individual elements from a collection of those elements only when all the elements are identical and they don't change, or they all change in the same way, in the same sequence to exactly the same events. That's called the Ergotic Theorem. Talk to your physicist friends about the Ergotic Theorem. The behavioral scientists have not known this. And so we've been out there developing normal this, abnormal that. It doesn't apply to individuals. And if you think it does because the average applies, you need to do some more serious reading. It's an error. It's a statistical error that's known. And when you get to processes of change, the metaphor I use would be like if you're trying to understand how to get from here to the other side of a building, and the door is locked to just walk through the first floor. Well, some might go down through the basement, some might go around to the left, some might go around to the right, somebody might have a ladder and go up over the roof. You average it and it'll say you should go right through the first floor. The door is locked, you can't do it. But that's what the average will give you. The average can give you things that no one does. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, except to say that once we care about processes of change, you then confront the ergotic error, and you then realize our concepts were built only in the last 150 years. Do you know the word normal in English wasn't used until the Civil War? And it was specifically developed by people like R.A. Fisher, who were outright eugenicists, outright, who wanted to sort human beings into the smart ones and the dumb ones so that the dumb ones wouldn't be bred. Go read about R.A. Fisher and where his methods came from. So it has a racist history, it's logically flawed, and it hasn't paid off for us. Never mind that rant, but it's a bigger issue. We need concepts that describe how individual people develop over time that are then collected into nomothetic statements about subgroups who are like that. And that's the journey that ACBS is on, this bottom-up, one person at a time tradition that, frankly, behavior analysis always had. You know, the individual animal with that history. And then you generalize to principles like reinforcement, not top-down. And here's the dirtiest secret of all of evidence-based therapy, EBT, meaning evidence-based therapy, is that it doesn't necessarily produce flourishing. So we have methods very well validated where your panic attacks will go down, but your life doesn't go up. Who wants methods like that? When you're dead, you won't have panic attacks. So what? How about a life worth living, as Marcia says? So we need to keep our eye on the prize. Let's let this biomedicalization of human suffering go into the ash bin of history. Do we want biologists with us? Yes. We want biologists who know about the developmental path of biology, who understand how genes, epigenes, neural systems evolve and are part of the larger team. And that's what we're doing inside ACBS. I write articles more with evolutionary biologists than almost anyone, but not this cartoon biology that we've become so entered into. Now, we had a good tradition, we the psychotherapists, with this Gordon Paul's famous question. What we want to know of our science is basically what treatment by whom is most effective for this particular individual with this particular problem, and under which set of circumstances, and how does it come about? I think it needs to be updated, but from the beginning, the contextual behavioral science wing has stuck to that, where we want to focus on functionally important pathways of change. And that's what's inside the psychological flexibility model. I think that model needs to be expanded somewhat. I'll explain later why. But let's start with what we know about processes of change using group designs, not individual designs. And let's not start with ACT. Let's start with the entire world's literature on psychotherapy and on psychological intervention. Let's start with a Catholic or universal look, small c Catholic, a universal look at the entire world's literature. Mediation in group comparison studies are how we can detect that a process is a functionally important part of change, that treatment modified a process, which then led to changes in outcome, controlling for treatment. That's very important. So it's not just a marker of treatment, which means even in the control group, if a person adopted that process by chance, it also would work there. And that when you keep track of that path, it takes the direct impact of treatment on outcomes and it significantly reduces or even eliminates that impact. That's how we know that something's a functionally important pathway of change. And so my colleagues, Stefan Hoffman, Joe Sorochi, and our students have for 2.5 years, unfunded, it's taken us a while with 50 of our students, have looked at every single randomized trial ever done on any psychological intervention method with any psychosocial outcome in the history of the world. And we've looked at every single one twice. We've done more than 110,000 ratings and determined what were the functionally important pathways. These are successful studies of mediation. We're just beginning to release the data. You will see it in written form, the first step of what will be about 5 articles in Behavior Research and Therapy in an invited article that we're writing right now. What we found is we can put all of the world's literature on processes of change into 6 psychological dimensions and 2 additional levels of analysis. In the psychological area, they all fit into affect, cognition, attention, self, motivation, or overt behavior. And then a number of them are sociocultural things or biophysiological things. And they all have something to do with creating healthy variation or change that is then selected for its benefit. And the ones that are helpful are retained in some way and fitted to context. Nothing that we can learn applies everywhere for everything. So all of the mediators can fit into that system, and that shouldn't surprise us because these are evolutionary concepts. And evolution is not just about genes. Now that we have full genomic analyses of hundreds of thousands of people, we know that genes don't directly lead to phenotypes. They're up and down regulated by epigenes. They interact with environment and behavior. So when we look at a larger view of evolution, we know that complex systems evolve by variation and retention of what's successful in context at the right dimension and level. Those 6 concepts explain basically how complex systems work. You can also distort it into a nice English acronym that you can pronounce as versatile. You have to change that a little bit, but variation retention was selected in context at the right dimension and level. So being versatile in that sense is part of what we need to do clinically. So here's what comes out of, this is the top 32 mediators in the entire world's literature. These are the functionally important pathways of change. I will give you a deeper dive on about the top 50 or 60 when we go dimension by dimension, level by level. But you can see some nice things in there if you're an ACT person: mindfulness, psychological flexibility, acceptance, values. I think is diffusion there? Yeah, diffusion's there. The larger words have more significant findings. Self-efficacy is the biggest one. Acceptance is next. If you put, often it's the same measure as psychological flexibility. If you put those 2 together, it would be the biggest. But I'll walk through this a little later on. Now, biggest doesn't mean necessarily with the biggest effect size. It's the most frequently found. We're doing the effect size analysis, and that's will be coming out next year. Now, you can't remember all that. Even that's too much for a clinician to remember. But we can take these dimensions, and the ACT model that you probably learn already has them, and these 2 levels, and think about variation, selection, retention, and context. If you wanted clinical words, you'd say, think about how do we create change? How do we recognize that we're making progress? How do we maintain gains? and how do we make sure it fits the moments of that person's actual life and the challenges of that situation. So we have ways clinically, we always have, of talking about evolutionary concepts because we're just rediscovering the same things. Evolution is a way of thinking about how it works, and our ways of thinking about how it works fit because they work. We've been applied evolutionists all along. We just you know it because it was so dominated by this gene-centric distortion of evolution. Evolution was never just about genes. Darwin knew nothing about genes, and so on. So this is the extended evolutionary meta model that Stefan and I have developed in the process-based therapy work. Now, it's not a periodic table. It's not like something to sort letters into boxes. It's really something more like this. These clusters of processes and contexts are influencing the probabilities of development. And the human being, like a ball rolling down, will be influenced by the probabilities of success within these processes of variation and retention that is influenced by these. It's complex, yes. I'm sorry, that's because life is complex. But we are making progress, and we can make this clinically relevant quickly, and ACT has been helping to do that. I think the best wings of CBT and evidence-based therapy also. Now, I'll very quickly remind us of our history in using this metaphor of waves. You know, CBT had an early kind of wave. It was dominated by animal learning. Its strengths were idiographic and it was process-oriented, but it leaves out human symbolic behavior. In the CBS universe, we think we've solved that with relational framing. And I have to say that in terms of a basic science, the basic science of relational framing, in my opinion, is much stronger than the basic science of mainstream clinical work, because there's no vigorous basic laboratory work that led to it. There was with ACT. Relational framing can be used with children who don't speak, or to measure implicit cognition, or to raise your IQ. Or so I'm not going to spend the time on it, but I will say we're part of an attempt to solve this problem. We recognized that animal learning alone is not enough. What you and I are doing right now is not what the bird outside the window is doing right now. We're the symbolic creatures. The second wave took that part very seriously, but didn't have a basic model. So we asked our clients, and we created our self-reports, and we had rational and irrational cognitions and cognitive errors and all that, which is fine. But it's not sufficiently basic, in my opinion. And it became easily focused too much on content, not enough on context and function. And so the mediators did not work that well. And that was very disturbing. The component analyses didn't work that well. If you go back and you say, I mean, for goodness sakes, if you look at Neil Jacobson's dismantling, these two huge multi-site studies with people like, Dobson, a very good cognitive therapist, having to write sentences like, the impact of CBT is not positively influenced by cognitive methods. I mean, that's a horror when you're 20 years into the development of your tradition. You should have known that earlier. I mean, I bow in his direction as a scientist. Would I have the courage to write such a sentence? I don't know. But Keith did. He should get an award for it. But we don't want to be in that position. We need to know the processes earlier, the components earlier. The third wave mixed everything up. People looked at the basic assumptions. They took a look afresh at the role of context and function. They started seeing that it wasn't what you think, but how you relate to what you think. It's not just what you feel, but how you relate to what you feel. Now, when I say it wasn't, there's still elements there. There are schemas. There are cognition matters. Cognitive change matters. That's in the ACT traditions too, but not in the simple way that we were thinking about it back in the heyday of traditional CBT. The traditional CBT model is pretty beaten up. It really is, if you look at processes of change and components. But the tradition is not beaten up because we're the scientist tradition, a very powerful part of that. And people have moved. And so it's hard to find a CBT person who doesn't care about mindfulness now, or doesn't know that values matters, or isn't interested in context. Now, what Stefan and I have done is basically say, well, given that, and of course, Stefan and I were arch enemies. Stefan was the defender of the flag and the winner of the Beck Award, and I was the rebel from the outside that was about to burn down the house. That was all cartoons. That was not real. Those are reporters writing stories. It's all fun, but it's not real. And we, in all of our arguments, have become best friends and very close colleagues because we realize that really what we care about are processes of change. And there's nothing to fight about. There's only things to learn. So we think this is now the goal of evidence-based therapy, to answer the question. It's a refreshed version of Gordon Paul's question. What core biopsychosocial processes should be targeted with this person, given this goal in this situation? And how can those processes most efficiently and effectively be changed? We're not treating syndromes. We're treating whole human beings. And our focus should be on processes that pay off for what they really want, ideally ones that have such broad application that they're useful in many domains, so that when you learn the lessons that life teaches you, that you have skills you can use with the challenges that are still to come. That is a different vision of evidence-based therapy. It draws on our traditions, the best part of our traditions. And ACT, I think, is one of the best developed forms of process-based therapy, but it's not the only one. And even inside ACT, we need to expand our model a little bit, I think. Treatment based on the coherent application of changeable evidence-based processes linked to evidence-based procedures or kernels or techniques that ameliorate the problems and promote the prosperity of people. That last part is important. We're not here to fix people. We're here to empower people. And their mental, behavioral, physical, social, and spiritual well-being is of concern to us. So we're part of the positive psychology view. What we mean by processes of change are just these sequences of changeable events that lead to good outcomes, that are theoretically sensible, dynamic, meaning they can operate forward and back in double-headed ways. They interact with other processes. They're progressive. Some things sometimes have to happen before something else. They're multi-level because you can't just look at psychology without looking at biology. You can't look at psychology and biology without looking at culture. You have to look at relationships and family and so on, and they're all contextually bound. And we need to put them into coherent, comprehensive, and broadly applicable models that summarize and simplify what's available. Why? Because we ourselves as clinicians can't deal with the level of complexity that processes will give you. There's already something like 120 pretty well-known processes from our meta-analysis that have at least 2 or 3 studies. when you get into the ones that have 5 or so, you're around 40, or when you have ones that have 8 or so, that's what you saw in that earlier. But already it's too complex, just 32 that you saw in that earlier slide. We need models that make that easier. So that's the game. Changeable processes linked to goals. And the same processes, like bricks, can be used in many different ways, depending on what your goal is. Sometimes just a little pathway, sometimes a gigantic mansion. It depends on what the challenge is. And why that matters clinically, because these are the proximal changes. That's why they function as mediators. If you focus only on client approval, whether or not they come in, only on outcomes, signs and symptoms, you are focusing on things that are farther down the road temporally. And the metaphor of shooting a basket, you know, if you got out in the backyard and I said, shoot a basket 100 times a day, you'd get better, no matter who you, with no coaching. You might have a bizarre way of shooting a basketball, but you'd get better. If I blindfold you and put earphones in, earplugs on you and say, do it 100 times a day, you will never get any better. Never. It's not practice makes perfect. It's feedback makes perfect. Feedback from practice makes perfect. Well, what is your feedback? We know it's bad. How do we know it's bad? Because the time in seat for a clinician does not predict the size of the outcomes. This study has been done 100 times. Experience predicts confidence. It doesn't predict competence for therapy. And that's a very rare event. In most areas of life, it predicts both confidence and competence, because in most areas you get immediate feedback that's good. If you're playing chess, or you're playing the flute, or you're playing bridge, or you're shooting basketballs, just practice alone with no coaching, you'll get better. Clinicians, practice alone, you may be the, as my mother used to say, the same verstunkene therapist you started with. I think that's Yiddish for stinking. So we need to do better than that. How can we do that? Feedback-informed therapy is very good, but what feedback? Why not the processes that predict the long-term outcomes that happen first? Why not? Well, what are those? Those are the ones I just showed you, the mediators, the processes of change. So that's what we're trying to do in ACT. Now, in terms of the ACT model, I like thinking about this as, you know, the ACT model is that you have an underlying motivation, a yearning, I would call it. The book, A Liberated Mind, I don't know if it's available in Romanian, it's over my shoulder, walks through the data on this. And then you frustrate it. Why would you frustrate it? Why would your repertoire get narrower? Because we have this evolutionarily a recent adaptation that comes from this wonderful, sweet fact that we're most cooperative. We're the most cooperative primates. We will naturally, even toddlers will pick up things and carry them together. Jane Goodall did not see chimpanzees doing it in the same way. They do cooperate, but not to the same degree. We understand even before language something about the intentionality of others. If I'm playing with this baby and I point to the book during cleanup time, the baby will try to put it in the into the toy box. If I just come in before it's cleanup time and point, the baby will try to give me the toy. A pre-verbal baby will make guesses about my intentions, and they understand something about me even by my own physiology. A baby will look at mama's eyes. A gorilla baby look at mama's head, and you can see why. A gorilla baby can't see where mama's eyes are looking. A human baby can. So we come physically prepared to understand intentionality. And this baby is an example of how early, this is a study done, an actual picture of a baby. You can't see it, but right there is Honey Nut Cheerios, which she really loves. And they have two puppets, one that's a mean puppet and one that's a sweet puppet. And then both puppets, one at a time, come over and beg for the treats. And the baby will give her precious treats to the sweet, nice puppet. But she's not gonna give it to the mean puppet. No, you get nothing. So even before language, we cooperate, we understand intentionality, and we are the ones that figured out a communication system that does that. By 12 months old, if I say that, for example, this is a cup, I'm drinking my coffee here in this cup that my wife gave me with a heart that makes me smile. I call it my love cup because it says love on it. It reminds me of my wife. But if we show a baby this and say cup, and then say the word cup, the little baby will try to find the cup. Our brains light up in the similar areas because we can take the perspective of others. That's all the way back to this moment. Even before language, we can take the perspective of others and we understand. If I say cup, maybe I'm needing the cup. Maybe you're supposed to reach and give it to me. 12-month-old babies, the so-called language trained chimps. And you may have heard of Washoe the chimp. That's because it's Washoe County. That's because the researcher is here in my department at the University of Nevada in Washoe County. And so I know that work very well. My colleagues right here in this same department had the language trained chimps. And when you flip it around, if you taught the animal in one direction, they give you random responses in the other direction. Not your baby. Your baby soon learns. If that's a cup is that. And from there, they quickly learn different, opposite, better. If this is better, then also that is worse. They learn that. They learn it as this is, I say, my ditty. This is relational frame theory in the form of 4 lines of a little ditty poem. You learn it in one direction, you derive it in 2, and you put it in networks that change what you do. That's the world we live in. How old is it? Well, we know the language trained chimps don't do it, so it's younger than 2.8 million years. That's nothing. Operant classical conditioning is 1,000 times older. It's 500 million years old. Your associative processes, contingency learning, how do we know that? Every organism since the Cambrian does it, and no organisms before the Cambrian does it. Does what? Operant classical conditioning. Habituation's even a little older. But what you and I are doing right now is fantastically recent. It might only be 250,000, 300,000 years old, which is nothing. No wonder we have mental problems. We haven't learned yet how to ride this tiger of being able to go anywhere and have somebody remind you of your past traumas. If you've had a car wreck and I say the word car, you'll react. You know, when you're looking at a panic disordered person in recovery, go look at my TED Talks. You know, back in the day, if somebody would say anxiety, I'd have a panic attack. I mean, just hearing the word. And then it would generalize in odd ways. If you said relaxation, I'd have a panic attack. A lot of you know about relaxation-induced panic. Why? Because as soon as you're thinking about relaxation, you're also thinking about, I hope I stay relaxed. I hope I don't get anxious. I hope, there it is. All roads lead to Rome. And this voice that allows us to problem solve, to do all the wonderful creative things, to create the machines that allow me to talk to you many thousands of miles away at 7:42 in the morning where I am, and I think somewhere around 6 something in the evening where you are. came from that repertoire, but it's the same repertoire that will tell you if you've been betrayed in love, never, ever allow yourself to be vulnerable again. You can't love somebody fully without being vulnerable. What it's telling you is you will never get what you want because it was painful in the past. No wonder people commit suicide. If that's the world we have to live in. But that world is the creation of this repertoire. It's not the real world we live in when we learn how to put it on a leash. And now we're swimming in a sea of language and judgment and fear and comparison. Our young people look at their iPhones from morning till night or whatever your smartphone you have, and you can see the Instagram posts of your friends and compare it to the misery inside you. I saw a picture of a person in the outback of Australia wearing a loincloth with a didgeridoo, looking at an iPhone of the gold-plated doorknobs of Donald Trump's bathroom. I mean, think about the world we've created, full of judgment and comparison and exposure to pain and horror. And that's a toxic triad. You better be a baby Buddha to deal with that world. But we're not training baby Buddhas. We're allowing capitalist kind of enterprises and so forth to feed nonsense to our children, where if you just have the right clothes, the right beer, the right car, the right whatever, that you'll be happy. It's a lie. It's always been a lie. So, what are we yearning for? What do we want? My claim is we want some things that are being mismanaged. And first and foremost, we want to belong because we're the social primates. Our eyeballs even allow us to connect to others. We are physically designed for connection. And when a baby is born, if that baby can't connect and nobody connects to that baby, within days, that baby will die. We're going to have the longest period of helplessness of any organism, complex organism. And what protects us is the group. Our belonging is life and death to us. And we do belong by birthright. When mama looks in that sweet baby's eyes, natural opiates are dumped in mama's brain and in the baby's brain. It's like, we're wired for this. But soon enough, along comes this repertoire, learn it in one, drive it in two, put it in networks that change what we do. That started with belonging. It started as an extension of cooperation, but then turned into problem solving. And we begin to think, okay, we'll belong by being special. You need me in your group. I will make your group great again. Maybe you can even wear a baseball cap with my name on it. Or, help me, I'm so pathetic, I'm so weak. Look at my cut marks, let me in. I'm sorry to say it in that voice as if I'm making fun of it. I'm not. But if you can't sniff the pride of pathology from your clients, you're not sniffing very hard. It's been a ticket in. People have come to them because of their tears and suffering. Only later do they leave. Only later does aloneness come. Because this way of belonging drives people away. And even if it doesn't, you know, if you think you're so special, you're so different, you're so great, and you're so grand. And if you're willing even to lie and to cheat to get people's adulation, why should you be lifted up by fools? They're not like me. I'm great and grand. It's empty. And you know it. Narcissism doesn't draw people to you. It drives people away. And it doesn't lift you up. It crushes your spirit. So the mind doesn't know how to belong. And what it says to do is toxic. We yearn to feel. Babies come into the world reaching and licking and testing, feeling and sniffing, and to the point we say, no, don't put that in your mouth. We don't have to be taught that. But then as language emerges with its judgment, we say, yes, I want to feel only the good stuff, only the sweet stuff, only the things that are sure, no fear, no sadness, no uncertainty. It doesn't come that way, my friend. Feelings don't come that way. Feelings are being here in the present and having your past inform you about what might be here in the present. And it might include sadness, but sadness is important. We buy tearjerker novels, etc. But not just that, we sit by the bedside, as I did only 4 years ago, with my hand on my mother, my 93-year-old mother, watching her feet turn black and her breath space, and then finally her last breath. And I would have paid 1,000 times $1,000 to be there. I'm incredibly painful, but sacred. Are we so stupid that we don't know that sadness matters? Are we that dumb? Have we allowed the commercial interests to so distort the human soul that we don't know that when people close to us die, sadness is what comes? So the mind is not able to be wise about these things. Judgment will tell you, run away, when what your heart yearns for is the capacity to feel. We want to have things be coherent. We do want to understand, but we have a mind that tells us we will only understand not when we look at what's functional, but when we look at what's true with a capital T. And there is no truth with a capital T. All of our opinions have another opinion. If you say, I'm a good person, you'll have little thoughts in your head, but not always. And you'll be reminded of all the things you've done that are not so good. If you said, I'm the horriblest, the worst, the most awful person, you'll have a little voice that says, no, there's things about you that are good. That's the way the mind comes. Yeah. So we won't be oriented that way. We won't find coherence that way. We want to be oriented. Even a mouse placed in the corner will run around the room when they know that they're safe to find out what's there. We want to be oriented by time and place, but our mind will take us to the distant past, the feared future, and we'll miss that we're here now. We literally will not know what's present. We want to have meaning. And if you've had children, you know that they're just little when they say, not that way. I want to do, no, I want, Mama, I want to do it my way. They start exerting their will when they're 2 and 3 years old. And we want them to do that. They need to learn how to do that. But soon enough, they get captured by the Instagram posts or by the YouTube influencers. And they mistake fame or money or likes on your social media to be a substitute for what your heart yearns for of meaning and purpose. And we yearn to be competent. We yearn to learn. That little toddler baby falls down on its diapered butt about 110 times a day for months on end while walking the equivalent of 10 football fields. That's a fact. It's no wonder we're tired when we have toddlers. And eventually, your foot, almost by accident, is in front of your other foot, and you hold your balance and you begin to toddle and walk. But you did it by trial and error, and you had many mistakes. But now we've created a world in which, our young people think that a success will come instantly. How many of you have a clinic or an agency where people who have 1 year of experience or 2 years of experience now want to be the supervisors? They want a promotion almost instantly. The data on this is very clear. There's been a generational shift because we've fed this kind of foolishness. And conversely, many of our clients live inside a similar kind of idea, just turned in a negative direction. So those are the inflexibility processes I've just visited. They're all a human need underneath it that is meant to be achieved. And we can achieve it. But we're going to have to learn to rein in this mode of mind that leads to these kind of postures. I've asked people around the world in a study that will soon be out to show me with your body you at your worst, and this is what they show me. It doesn't matter if you're wearing burqas and you're in Iran, if you're wearing a loincloth and you're in Australia, or if you're wearing a 3-piece suit or farmer's clothing, this is what you show, you at your worst. If I say, what's you at your best with this same exact issue, people show you an open posture where their head is up, their eyes are open, and their arms and hands are free. And what does that say? We know that being closed, shutting down our consciousness and defending is harmful. Being open, expanding our consciousness and giving us the freedom to do and to learn is helpful. We know that before ACT, and we knew that before the Instagrams and the social media and the commercial interests tried to convince us otherwise, to sell us goods. So unfortunately, our problem-solving mind doesn't know better. And it thinks that it should meet these needs by these methods that are harmful. But we're going to have to learn how to meet them by putting the mind on a leash and realizing the problem-solving mind is only part of us. We can use it. We can learn new thoughts. We can problem solve, but we can't let it completely dominate us. That's what the ACT model does. It says, take that energy that you mishandled and narrowed your repertoire, and instead put that energy into behavior that expands your repertoire. And instead of these smaller, sooner consequences of, for example, the relief of avoidance, speaking as a panic disordered person in recovery, when I said no to giving a talk, I felt better. I didn't feel better. I felt better because I was relieved. But then in the long run, the panic disorder grew and grew and grew to the point that it was going to take everything, even my capacity to speak to classes as a professor. So instead, we take that energy into behavior that will lead to a larger, later reward as we focus on function and not just on form. And that's what we're trying to do inside the ACT model, is that if I speak in a very general way that connects with our CBT and our humanistic and analytic colleagues, that we can speak this way. We're trying to open up emotional and cognitive flexibility, allowing healthy variation to occur, because emotion and cognition are the two primary ways we shut down the flexibility of our repertoire. We want attentional flexibility and to be able to take the perspective on our own actions and take the perspective of others, which allows us to see what the current context inside and out affords, and to do that consciously from this point of awareness. And then we want to be able to put our life's moments, our behavioral flexibility, into meaning by choice, our values, if you will, which is how all of these other things are selected and can be retained. So there are those evolutionary concepts of variation, selection, retention in context. They're right inside the ACT model, which is the solution to these challenges I've talked about. We call it psychological flexibility. It's these processes you probably already know that meet these yearnings in a healthy way. And we can quickly walk through that because of the clock. I'll do it very quickly. As we, for example, take this conceptualized self, and I'll give you the slide set, has a few more things in here so you can see, or you can learn a little bit more from the slide set. We take the conceptualized self from mishandling our perspective taking abilities, and instead we expand it out to connection with others in this more transcendent sense of self, or perspective taking sense of self, that connects us in consciousness to others. We take this tendency to run away from our own emotions and bodily sensations, and instead we move it towards opening up to pain when it's part of something that's useful, and to joy without having to downregulate joy out of the knowledge, the certain knowledge that it will go away. Yes, that's true. Like that example I used of detuning love because you want to avoid vulnerability. That we take the excessive cognitive entanglement that comes from literal language, where we're not aware of the process, this mental voice within, this dictator within, I call it, just like in The Wizard of Oz, and instead pull the curtain back and realize that that voice comes from your history. Sometimes it's mother's voice, sometimes it's your dad's voice or your sibling, sometimes it's your own ideas, but it's just one of many ways of thinking of a situation. And you can instead put your mind on a leash. And instead of the kind of chaotic attentional processes that we normally fall into, that we can have attention be directed in a way that's flexible, fluid, and voluntary. We can maintain our attention when that's helpful. We can shift our attention when that's helpful. We can narrow our attention when that's helpful. We can expand the range of our attention when that's helpful. And that instead of being pushed around in our direction by impulse or by being dictated to by the interests of others, that we can make our choices based on the kind of person that we want to be, the kind of qualities that we want to reveal in our chosen life moments. And no, we will never live up to it completely, in the same way I never live up to this symbol that's on this cup. I'm a work in progress. I fail almost every day, ask my wife. But it's a lighthouse in the distance. Yeah. I'm getting better. I care about it, one step at a time. And that we take this either instant gratification or putting life on hold and procrastination, and instead we put meaning into the creation of patterns, habits of values-based action that are healthy or that contribute to others, that are what we really want. And essentially what we're doing here is we're now taking these yearning for belonging that ends up in lying, defending, and pretense, and we put it into consciousness and awareness that allows real belonging. We take this yearning to feel that was distorted into this idea that I'll only feel good, and ended up with I can't even feel at all, and instead turning it into feeling good and deliberately expanding our capacity to feel in a way that fits our long-term health. That we put the mind on a leash and stop trying to put everything in a little cleaned up cognitive cubbyhole, and instead allow many different thoughts to happen and focus on what's useful, learn how to let go of the rest. Letting go, not meaning you subtract it or eliminate it, but simply that you're bringing your attentional processes that have become automatic and habitual and carried out of the present into attending to what's present in your thoughts, in your feelings, in your body, in ways that are helpful. So you end up with attentional processes that are flexible, fluid, and voluntary, and that you can then link those mindfulness skills to meaning by choice, the chosen qualities of being and doing, what you want to manifest, the kind of story that you're trying to create in your life, the best you that you want to be, that you're clear about your values, knowing that they can change, it's a choice, and that you're constantly bringing your habits of mind and behavior into alignment, building larger and larger patterns of values-based action, grooved in such a way that even when you're not mindful, your mindless habits are bumping you in the right direction. So that's a summary of the ACT approach, is that we're going to learn to put our mind on a leash, that we're going to learn then how to feel more openly all of what's there to be felt, that we're going to notice more clearly the inside and the out, and we're going to do that consciously with awareness, that we'll be clearer about what it is that we really want to be about, what we want to stand for, what we're up to, and that we'll practice and practice and practice on how to get better at bringing that into our life's moments. If you want to get it into 3 columns, just like in that earlier slide, how to be more open, aware, and actively engaged in life. If you want a single phrase, how to be more psychologically flexible. The evolutionary sense of that is that all of these processes involve healthy variation and selection, but some of them really need to be context specific. So you need this witnessing self and attentional process, and they need to be put into the key things that lead to retention, which is practice and larger patterns, habits, and repetition. So the strengths of these processes then allow us to move ourselves forward where we care. Now, I'm going to say just a couple more things and then move to questions. We are in a very different era right now. It's very rapidly opening up in the ACT community. For the first time in 40 years, we're no longer the rebels at the gate. we've been inside the castle for a while. Maybe in 2004, we were at the gate, but now we're inside the house. But now it's beyond that. The WHO, for example, the World Health Organization, if you want help with COVID, they offer you only one thing, an ACT cartoon book. There's the link. Why? Because they did a randomized trial with South Sudanese refugees who have nothing other than their life, maybe their children, and the clothes on their back, who are in Uganda sitting in dirt. And that cartoon book and an audio tape written by some of our ACT leaders, Russ Harris and others, evaluated by some of our ACT good, solid researchers, Felicity Brown, Ross White, had effect sizes as large as self-help in your country or in mine. And now I can tell you, because it's a talk by Ross at HCBS WorldCon. It's been replicated in Turkey with Syrian refugees and in the European Union with a wide range of refugees, not just on distress, but on the development of mental health disorders. So we are within a couple months of worldwide distribution of ACT as the broadest, what they call, what is the phrase they use? Scalable psychological intervention. This is the NICE guidelines on chronic pain, just came out this, a couple weeks ago. And much to the consternation of pain doctors and back pain surgeons, this group, which is not psychologists, these are the biomedical statisticians. And if you know the UK NICE folks, they are not nice. That's just an acronym. They are the toughest of the tough. And they now say no to the anti-inflammatories, the opioids, the benzodiazepines for chronic pain. What do they say yes to? Exercise, acupuncture, ACT, and CBT. So we're entering into a world, this one is a smoking cessation app that beat the consensus app developed by the National Cancer Institute in the US. The very best smoking researchers in the world created this app. Jonathan Bricker just showed his ACT app beats it by about a third in long-term smoking cessation. And the Surgeon General of the United States invited him to come and give a talk on ACT. My point being, those more than 500, if you go and look at the ACVS site, you only see 480, but that's because we're going to make a big announcement and post them all at once. That's a secret, don't tell anyone. I say 525, it looks like we'll be at like 540. Randomized controlled trials are in almost every area and can meet the best in almost every area and can beat the best in some areas. And in the areas where they meet it, there's moderation. Sometimes ACT is not as good as other methods, and sometimes ACT is better depending on the exact properties of the person. I'll give you an example. CBT for anxiety disorders, if you only have that and it's limited and only one, CBT and exposure is probably better than ACT and exposure if you have more than one specific thing, or you have a tendency towards depression, or you have more complexity. It makes perfect sense to me. ACT in this way is a little more challenging and fundamental. It raises issues of sense of self and all of that. And sometimes pretty straightforward CBT exposure will do it. Single problems, more minor problems. More complex, ACT is better. That's from Michelle Krask, one of the best clinical researchers in the world, and certainly not an ACT person, she's CBT person. So these huge number of ACT RCTs that we spent so many years working and working and working on processes, measures, philosophy of science, components, with only 4 randomized trials over the first 16 years. Now has to a point where we get a new randomized trial every 4 days. And so final thing I want to say, I know I'm going a little long, but the psychological flexibility model. Here now I want to give you all the processes of change that have at least, I think it's 4 studies supporting it up through 2018 when we stopped our. In the area of affect, the bigger the words, the more data. So yes, acceptance, but look at the others. Self-compassion, isn't that kind of the same thing? I'd say yes. The acceptance measures, self-compassion measures correlate 0.75. Anxiety sensitivity, isn't that kind of an emotional openness measure? Yes, it is. Intolerance of uncertainty versus tolerance, isn't that emotional openness? Yes, it is. Emotion regulation, what are you talking about? Well, things like the DERS. The DERS has an acceptance scale at the beginning of it. It's the biggest factor in the whole thing. There's nothing in there that isn't. So non-reactivity, do you see? Isn't this all emotional openness? I'd say it's all related. How about motivation, values? Yes, but also goals, intentions, planning. Can you link it to behavior, action planning? Intrinsic motivation, what is that? It's values. Is there anything hostile to the ACT model there? No. How about the behavioral mediators? Undermining avoidance, committed action, but just behavioral activation. But behavioral activation is doing things that can lead to possible reinforcers, social skills, coping skills. Again, all of these things, are they hostile to the committed action part of ACT? No, they're not. They're just, by the way, all of these words are the researcher's own words. That's why you're seeing synonyms. We refuse to reinterpret. So if you want to call it a particular name, it's here. So there's no bias in what I'm showing you other than the researcher's original. How about cognition? If you're a CBT person and you're not so sure about ACT, okay, well, let's look at this. Cognitive diffusion, pretty big dog in the pen. These other ones, like disappearing into rumination and worry, diffusion, and probably as a CBT person, you'd say reappraisal, is kind of the anti-rumination, anti-worry process. Yes? Well, what about reappraisal? Isn't this a matter of detecting, challenging, disputing, and changing? No, because reappraisal, we now know, works by cognitive flexibility. It works by the ability to entertain multiple thoughts and pick ones that are most useful. I can show you the data that reappraisal is itself mediated by cognitive flexibility and diffusion. So one of the things that says to the ACT people is we need to take reappraisal seriously. We always did, but we actually should embrace the word. In the same way that in the emotion side, it's not just accepting the negative emotions, it's not being attached to the positive ones. Clinging is a form of repertoire narrowing. Emotional flexibility means both emotional difficulties and letting go of attachment to particular kind of so-called positive emotion. Joy junkies don't live happy lives. They do not. Just look at your favorite drug addict and you'll see it. You're looking at a joy junkie. They know how to produce it and to fix it and hold on to it. So what in here is hostile? The only thing that in there would be if we thought we're getting rid of thoughts in order to have thoughts, but that's not how it works. The data shows that's not how it works. How about attention? Well, mindfulness is so much about attention to the now, and rumination is not disappearing into the past or future. There's nothing in there that's hostile to an expanded view of the psychological flexibility model. Things that have to do with sense of self, I mean, you do have decentering is very close to the self as context. This more spiritual sense of self, same thing. What about self-efficacy? Well, I don't know if that's just a sense of self, but that has something to do with this idea that you can, with your effort, change your life and move in a positive direction. And that's deeply inside the psychological flexibility model of values-based action. How about this other level of the sociocultural dimension? And here I'll stop. So after I do this, just a couple of slides. I'm sorry for going 20 minutes over. The Therapeutic Alliance. There are people who say it's only the Therapeutic Alliance that matters. Parenting, well, those are, you had your parents, pray for good ones, but if you didn't have good ones, you know, we're going to have to deal with that. Social support. I'll talk about these after I explain the Therapeutic Alliance, and you'll see. What we know about the Therapeutic Alliance is one way that it works is that it models acceptance, non-judgment, being present with another person, connecting consciously, having their values matter, and pursuing ends that are important to them. Those are the 6 flexibility processes. You, when you have a good therapeutic alliance, model that. How do we know that? Because in multiple studies, when you measure changes in the psychological flexibility of the client, and I could say this another way that will make this easy to understand, the internalization of what a good therapist models. When they don't go, oh, you thought that? Oh, they're modeling, it's okay to have odd thoughts. It's okay to have difficult feelings. You stand with them. You walk into the hell of their history. Yeah. If they internalize it and do that themselves, when you take changes in then they start changing in psychological flexibility. And if you measure the client's psychological flexibility and the Therapeutic Alliance, there are no studies in which the Therapeutic Alliance is still a mediator. And that's not because it's not important. It's because it's important in modeling something for the client. Another way to say it, and the analysts have said this, you have to internalize the alliance. Does this make sense to you? Of course. Otherwise, you just move in with your therapist. When you walk out, your therapist has to come with you. You have to internalize it. If you do that, the psychological flexibility processes move, because that's what they're revealing and how they walk through. So the therapeutic, and now you can see social support and other things in the same way. Good parenting, authoritative, not authoritarian parents, who are they? We know they're psychologically flexible parents. We've done the studies. So again, so here, I'm sorry for going 20 minutes beyond, but I'm just saying, we are at our 5 out of 5 moment right now, where the entire world knows they need us. They need the therapist. It can't just be in therapy. It's going to have to be moved into our culture. But what needs to be moved there? Healthy psychological processes. What is that? Psychological flexibility expanded by our colleagues who have helped us with so many of these other kinds of processes that enrich and vitalize and fill out what the psychological flexibility model can mean. And that when our minds draw us into this, that we know how, by applying our processes, to turn our mental set, our mindset, and our lives into something more like this.